is not in view here. It is a preparation, a reserving for Judgment Day, as we saw in 2 Peter chapter 2. So, away from the end, that is, during the 7 months, during the Great Tribulation, they shall search. Now, and then verse 15 is a difficult one. And the passengers, that is, the true believers that pass through the land, when they see a man's bone. Now, if you see a man's bone, he's dead. You're looking at a corpse. And then they are to set up a sign by it till the buriers have buried it in the land of Ham and Gog. Now, I have to back up here and emphasize another point that each time I have to emphasize, and that is the true believers are not acting alone. They are acting with Christ, all together with Christ. Let me emphasize, let's read again. I'm finding an enormously important passage in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 20. Or 51, verse 20. And this is a passage that we all should really know about it. Because God is saying here, and He's talking to the true believers in Revelation 51, verse 20, "Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war." You are the army that I'm using to do my work on the earth. Just like we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. You are my ambassadors, Christ, as it were, making His appeal through you. In other words, we reign with Christ. We are servants of Christ. We are His army. Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war. For with thee will I, and here it shows the exact tie-in of Christ with this army of true believers, will I break in pieces the nations, and with thee, that's the body of believers, will I destroy kingdoms, and with thee will I break in pieces the horses and the rider, and with thee will I break in pieces the chariot and its rider. With thee will I break in pieces man and woman, and with thee will I break in pieces young and old, and with thee will I break in pieces, and so on and so on. Why is God just emphasizing and emphasizing and emphasizing this in this passage? Just as you read it, you notice it just drives the point home. I and my army have everything to do with all this judgment process. And that is why when we read in Ezekiel 39 about a sign and so on, remember, we're not acting alone. It isn't what our eyes see, it is what God sees. Because that is Christ, and the army, which are the true believers, are unified, are acting as one action, one, and in God's whole final judgment process, as He is reserving the people that have to go. And so we have to keep that in mind, as it says here, when we read in verse Ezekiel 39, it says in verse 15, "And the passengers," that is the true believers, "that pass through the land, when any seeth a man's bone, they see the evidence of death." And what is the evidence of death? Here we have the wheat and the tares in the churches particularly. The tares have always looked as holy and as wonderfully the child of God as the wheat. And we could not tell at all whether they were, we would never make a judgment of any kind that maybe they are not a child of God. But now God has set up the testing time, the great tribulation, and the first great test was you have to get out of the churches. Well, no, ahead of that, there's that other great test. Remember, the whole Bible is the Word of God. Every word came from the mouth of Christ. And that's That's a test that all kinds of pastors fail. All kinds of people that call themselves believers fail. They say, oh, no, this God inspired Luke to write, but Luke wrote it in his own words, and this is the word of Luke, and this is the word of Isaiah, and this is the word of Moses, and so on. It was all written out of their understanding and personality, but God guided them so that God could approve what they finally wrote down. No way, no way. They received the word by dictation. But is that acceptable now to the churches? If it were, you would think then these theologians, these seminary professors, these pastors that have doctor's degrees and so on would say, oh, well, then we better do a lot more intensive study, because we didn't understand that when we went to seminary, because no seminary teaches that at all. But no, they're not. They're saying, another kooky idea that comes out of family radio, that we have to believe that. And so they're failing the test. And when we see that test being failed, we are seeing a man's bone. We are seeing death. We're seeing somebody who is probably heading for judgment. And then the barriers will come. But remember, the barriers are under the control of God. Christ, this is all being done locked in with Christ, working with the true believers. And if they persist in this, it may very well be evidence that these individuals have been locked in for the day of judgment. What frightens me, for example, just, humanly speaking, and of course I have a lot of loved ones and friends still in the church, because when you've been in the church for 70 years, you get a lot of people who you have loved in times past and who are there, and yet they're not stirring. They're just not stirring. When we talk about the end of the church, no way, that can't be. And when we talk about some of these other tests, they like the time, they just don't move. And so what we're seeing, and this is what makes it a very, very scary thing, is what we're seeing is that they are spiritually dead at this moment. And the sign is, and there is a sign that shows this, that sign is that they insist on that the churches are still belong to Christ, and that we can't know the day of judgment and things like that. They're insisting on that, and so those signs are indicating these people are spiritually dead, and these are the ones that God, as He marshals the barriers, that is, as we continue to insist on these things, that they are being reserved, they're being cast into hell, they're being buried, they're being reserved for the day of judgment. They're still alive, physically alive, even as the angels are physically alive who have been cast into hell, but nevertheless, they are reserved for the day of judgment. There's no hope for the fallen angels, no hope at all. And for increasingly for those who insist we can't know that Christ is coming as a thief in the night. We know that the church will go there right till the end. It's Christ's church, and so on, and will not come out. They are showing that they are dead. This is the sign that is there so that Christ, as He leads the passengers, the barriers, they are being prepared for the day of judgment. They've been cast into hell. Yes, I said that in the past tense. They've been cast into hell, exactly as the angels have been cast into hell, that God talks about in 2 Peter chapter 2. And They're being buried in the valley of Hamon-Gog. Remember, that's Israel. That is principally these are in the churches, and that's where they are. They have been bound and in chains, preparing for the day of judgment.